The Vorath Dominion had been conquering the galaxy for nearly 100 years, and no one had ever stopped them. Their warships were not built like the ships of other species, because the Vorath did not build their ships at all, but instead grew them like living creatures in massive organic pools on their homeworld. These bioorganic vessels could heal themselves when damaged and could adapt to any weapon that was used against them. More than once, their soldiers were equally terrifying, as they could regenerate from wounds that would kill any other creature in the galaxy. 10 times over, Supreme Commander Thalvex stood on the bridge of his flagship called the Devouring Dawn and watched the stars pass by through the massive viewing window. He was ancient by the standards of his people, having lived for over 300 years and having personally overseen the conquest of 11 civilizations. His body was covered in the ceremonial scars of victory, and his forearms bore the markings of every species he had crushed beneath the might of the Dominion. Behind him stood Fleet Marshal Kyrith, who was younger and more eager, and who had proven himself in the recent campaign against the Pellucid Collective. The Pellucid had been a species of beings made of living crystal who could communicate through pure thought, and who had terrified their neighbors for thousands of years. They had lasted exactly 6 days against the Vorath, before their leaders had crawled before Thalvex and begged for mercy. There had been no mercy, of course, because the Vorath did not believe in such weakness. The Pellucid were now slaves working in the genetic harvesting facilities, where their unique biology would be studied and absorbed into the Dominion's ever-growing arsenal. This was the way of things, and had been for a century. Vorath conquered, and the galaxy trembled, and no one could stand against them. Thalvex pulled up the conquest records on the holographic display before him, and felt a familiar satisfaction as he reviewed the list of fallen civilizations. The crystalline Shokari had been first to fall, and their technology for manipulating light had been added to. Vorath weapons, the ancient Melvian Accord, had come next, and their knowledge of subspace travel had made the Dominion fleet faster than ever before. The warrior clans of Reth Prime had fought bravely but futilely, and their genetic material had been used to make Vorath soldiers even stronger. 17 civilizations in total had been absorbed, and each one had made the Dominion more powerful. It was a perfect system, and Thalvex saw no reason why it should ever. Ankirath approached with a data tablet in his hands and bowed his head in the traditional gesture of respect before speaking. Supreme Commander, we have completed our survey of the remaining unexplored sectors, and there is one region that shows promise for our next campaign. Thalvex turned his massive head and fixed his subordinate with all 4 of his eyes. Show me. The holographic display shifted to show a region of space that was colored gray on Dominion maps, indicating that it had not yet been contacted or conquered. It was a relatively small area containing perhaps 50 star systems, and it sat on the edge of the galaxy, far from the major powers that the Vorath had already crushed. What species inhabits this region? Thalvex asked. Kyrith consulted his data tablet before responding. They call themselves humans, Supreme Commander, and they are a young species that achieved faster than light travel only 3 centuries ago. Young, Thalvex repeated with something like amusement in his deep voice. Very young, Kyrith confirmed, and his tone carried the dismissive quality that all Vorath used when discussing inferior species. They have spread to approximately 40 worlds, but their expansion has been slow and chaotic, because they cannot seem to stop fighting among themselves. This caught Thalvex's attention, and he leaned forward with interest. They fight their own kind, constantly, Supreme Commander, and it is quite remarkable. Really? Kyrith pulled up additional data on the display showing the political structure of human space. They have no unified government, but instead are divided into dozens of factions that compete for resources and territory, and they have fought 3 major wars among themselves in just the last century alone. Thalvex studied the information and felt his confidence growing with every detail. This was exactly the kind of species that the Dominion had conquered many times before. Fragmented and divided civilizations were always the easiest to defeat because they could not mount a unified defense, and often their various factions would even turn on each other in hopes of gaining favor with the conquerors. "What is their military capability?" he asked. "Primitive by our standards," Kyrith replied. "They use chemical propulsion for their missiles, and their ships are made of simple metal alloys that cannot adapt or regenerate, and their largest vessels are perhaps 1/10 the size of our dreadnoughts. And their numbers, they have approximately 200 military vessels spread across their 40 worlds. But most of these are small patrol craft designed for fighting each other rather than repelling an external invasion." Thalvex made his decision in that moment because there was really no decision to make. The humans were weak and divided and primitive, and they would fall just as every other species had fallen before the might of the Varth Dominion. "Assemble a fleet," he commanded, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "We will offer them the standard terms of submission or annihilation, and I expect they will choose submission within days of our arrival." Kyrith bowed again and hurried to carry out his orders. Within hours, the Dominion fleet had gathered in formation around the Devouring Dawn. 400 capital ships stretched across the void like a wall of organic death, and 2,000 support vessels filled the spaces. Between them, it was the largest fleet the Varth had assembled in decades, and it was almost certainly overkill for a species as primitive as humanity, but Thalvex believed in overwhelming force because it sent a message to any other species that might be watching. The message was simple and had been delivered 17 times before: resist and die, or submit and serve. There were no other options. The fleet engaged their subspace drives, and reality twisted around them as they punched through the barrier between normal space and the dimension that allowed faster than light travel. Thalvex watched the swirling colors of subspace through the viewing window and allowed himself to imagine the glory that awaited him. Conquest and another species brought to heel, and another step toward total galactic domination. He had done this so many times that it had become almost routine. He expected the campaign against humanity to last perhaps a month at most, and probably much less given how divided and weak they appeared to be. Supreme Commander of the Varth Dominion had made only one mistake in his long career of conquest. Had assumed that humanity would behave like every other species he had encountered. He had no way of knowing that humans were not like other species at all. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in human space, 7 massive ships waited in hidden shipyards ready to defend their people against any threat. He had no way of knowing that humanity had been preparing for this moment since the day they first reached the stars, and he had absolutely no way of knowing that he was leading his fleet toward the beginning of the end of everything the Varth Dominion had built. The unstoppable tide was about to meet an immovable wall, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Varth fleet emerged from subspace at the edge of a star system that the humans called Kepler 442, and for a moment the void was filled with the twisted light of 400 warships. Returning to normal space, Supreme Commander Thalvex stood at his usual position on the bridge of the Devouring Dawn and watched as his sensors began to map the system before him. There was a large gas giant at the center of the system, surrounded by dozens of mining platforms and cargo vessels, and beyond that small rocky world where 3 million humans lived and worked it was a minor colony by any standard, and Thalvex had chosen it specifically because destroying such a target would send a message to the rest of humanity without requiring any real effort. "Begin standard approach," he commanded, and his voice echoed across the bridge. "Launch scanner drones and prepare the translation systems for first contact." The fleet began to move forward in perfect formation with the capital ships forming a wall of organic death and the support vessels spreading out to cut off any escape routes. This was a procedure that the Vorath had performed many times before, and every crew member knew their role perfect. Like Kyreth monitored the incoming sensor data and began to compile his report for the Supreme Commander. The colony appears to be primarily industrial in nature, he said. Mining operations focused on the gas giant and some light manufacturing on the planet's surface and population of approximately 3 million, as our intelligence suggested. Defenses? Thalvex asked. Minimal, and there appear to be a few orbital weapons platforms, but nothing that could threaten our fleet, and their shields are. Kyreth paused and checked his readings again, actually quite primitive by our standards. Thalvex nodded with satisfaction because this was exactly what he had expected. The humans were young and weak, and they had clearly never faced a real threat from beyond their own borders. This would be over quickly. Open a communication channel, he ordered. Let them see the size of our fleet and inform them of our terms. The communication officers worked their consoles, and within moments, a channel was established with the colonial government. Thalvex delivered the same message that had been delivered to 17 civilizations before. People of this world, you are now subjects of the Vorath Dominion, and you will surrender your government, your military assets, and your population for processing, or you will be annihilated, and there is no third option. The response came not from the colonial government, but from somewhere else. Entirely a human female appeared on the view screen wearing what appeared to be a military uniform with insignia. That Thalvex did not recognize. Her face was hard, and her eyes showed no fear whatsoever. This is Captain Sarah Okonkwo of the United Earth Defense Force, she said, and her voice was steady and calm. You have entered human space without permission, and you are hereby ordered to withdraw immediately. Thalvex was so surprised by this response that he actually laughed, and it was a deep rumbling sound that made the bridge crew shift nervously at their stations. You are ordering me to withdraw, he said. Child, you do not seem to understand your situation, and perhaps you cannot see my fleet, so let me show you. He gestured to his communications officer, who transmitted a full sensor image of the Dominion Armada, 400 capital ships and 2,000 support vessels, and more firepower than most species could assemble in 1,000 years. Captain Okonkwo studied the image for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was not the smile of someone who was afraid, or someone who was bluffing. It was the smile of someone who knew something that Thalvex did not. We see your fleet, she said, and we are not impressed. The channel went dead. Kyreth turned to his commander with confusion written across his alien features. Supreme Commander, I am detecting movement from the human military vessels in the system, and they appear to be forming up an attack formation. How many ships do they have? Thalvex asked. 12 vessels, and all of them appear to be frigate class at most and smaller than our smallest escort ships. 12 ships against 400. Thalvex could not believe what he was seeing, because no species had ever been foolish enough to attack a Vorath fleet with such pathetic numbers. It was suicide, and it was madness, and it was the 12 human ships accelerated not toward escape routes as any sane species would have done, but directly toward the Dominion fleet at speeds that should have killed their crews from the Gi forces alone. Kyreth's voice cracked with disbelief as he reported what his sensors were showing him. Commander, they are attacking, and they are actually attacking us. Then destroy them, Thalvex snapped. Show them what happens to those who defy the Dominion. The Vorath fleet opened fire with weapons that had shattered planetary shields and cracked the hulls of dreadnoughts, and reduced entire civilizations to ash. The human ships should have been vaporized in the first volley. They were not. Instead, they twisted and spun through the incoming fire. With maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics, 3 of the 12 ships were hit, and those 3 exploded in nuclear fire rather than allow themselves to be captured. But the other 9 kept coming, and then they fired back. The missiles they launched were primitive things using chemical propulsion and simple guidance systems, and the Tavadan systems and the Varath defensive systems should have stopped them easily, but these missiles did not carry explosive warheads. The first one struck the cruiser Eternal Hunger, and its bioorganic hull should have simply absorbed the impact and regenerated within seconds. Instead, the hull began to dissolve. The missile had carried a payload of engineered bacteria, designed specifically to consume the organic material that made up Vara's ships, and within minutes the Eternal Hunger was breaking apart as billions of microscopic organisms ate it from the inside. The cruiser's crew died screaming as their own ship consumed itself around them. More missiles struck more ships, and each one carried a different payload. Some carried the hull-eating bacteria, while others carried electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the neural networks that Vorath ships used for coordination. Others carried clouds of nanomachines that burrowed into weapon systems and caused them to misfire by the time the human ships finally broke off their attack and retreated into the void. That Vorath had lost 11 ships, 11 warships destroyed by 12 frigates. Thilvev stared at the debris field that had once been his cruisers and felt something he had not experienced in decades of conquest. It was a cold feeling in his chest and a tightness in his throat, and it took him a long moment to recognize it for what it was. Fear. How? Kyrith whispered, and his voice was barely audible. How did they do that? Thalvex had no answer because he had never seen weapons like those before. Every species he had conquered had used conventional explosives or energy weapons or kinetic projectiles. None of them had thought to create bacteria that could eat a ship alive or nanomachines that could turn a vessel's own systems against it. These humans fought dirty, and they fought smart, and they had clearly been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The Supreme Commander looked out at the stars, and for the first time in his long career, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. War had begun, and the Vorath Dominion did not retreat. They would push forward, and they would conquer these humans no matter what it took. And somewhere in the darkness of space, Captain Sarah Okonkwo watched the Vorath fleet lick its wounds, and she knew that this was only the beginning. The first blood had been drawn, but the real war was yet to come. 3 months had passed since the first battle at Kepler 442, and the Vorath Dominion had learned that conquering humanity would not be as easy as they had expected. Every system they entered became a trap. The humans hid weapons inside asteroids that looked completely ordinary until a Vorath ship passed too close, and then they would explode with enough force to cripple even the largest cruiser. They seeded jump points with autonomous mines that drifted silently through the void until their sensors detected an enemy vessel and then accelerated toward their targets with suicidal determination. They broadcast false signals that lured Vorath scouts into ambush where human ships would appear from hiding spots in debris fields and asteroid belts and attack from all directions at once. Supreme Commander Thalvex had never faced an enemy like this. The species he had conquered before had always fought in straight lines with honor and dignity, and they had always lost because the Vorath were simply stronger. But the humans did not care about honor or dignity. They cared about winning, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to achieve that goal. In 3 months, the Dominion had taken only 4 human systems, and they had lost 92 ships in the process. 92 ships destroyed by a species that his intelligence officers had described as primitive and divided. Thalvex stood on the bridge of the devouring dawn and stared at the star map before him as if he could force the human territories to submit through sheer willpower alone. Kireth approached with another report, and the fleet marshal looked as tired and frustrated as his commander felt. Our scouts have identified a major human defensive position at their colony called Proxima, he said. This appears to be one of their oldest and most developed worlds, and our analysts believe they will make a significant stand here. How significant? Delvex asked. We expect heavy fortifications and a large fleet presence, and possibly new weapon systems that we have not yet encountered. The Supreme Commander considered this information and made his decision. Then, we will meet them with overwhelming force and assemble every ship we can spare, and we will crush this Proxima and break the human spirit once and for all. The Vorath fleet gathered for what they believed would be the decisive battle of the War. 200 capital ships and over 1,000 support vessels jumped toward Proxima with weapons charged and crews ready for the fight of their lives. When they emerged from subspace, they found something they did not expect: a single ship. It hung in the void between the jump point and the planet like a silent guardian, and it was massive. Vessel was nearly as large as a Vorath dreadnought, and its hull was black and covered in strange angles that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different directions. Sensor readings fluctuated wildly as if the ship existed in multiple states at once, and targeting systems struggled to lock onto anything solid. "What is that?" Kyrith breathed. "One ship," Dalvex said slowly. "They send one ship against our entire fleet, and they must be desperate or insane or both. Should we scan it?" "Commander." "Yes, and tell me everything you can about that vessel." The sensor officers worked their consoles, and their faces grew more confused and worried with every reading they took. "Supreme Commander, the results make no sense, and the ship's power output is fluctuating between levels we have never seen before, and some of its systems read as human technology, while others match the Shokari crystal arrays we absorbed decades ago, and others still are completely unknown to our databases." Dalvex felt a chill run through his ancient body. The Shokari had been conquered 60 years ago, and their technology had been added to the Dominion arsenal. How could a human ship possess weapons from a species that had been enslaved before humanity even achieved faster than light travel? Unless the humans had found something old, something powerful, something that predated even the ancient civilizations that the Vorath had conquered before he could order a retreat. The strange ship fired a beam of pale blue light, lanced across the void, and struck this consuming night, which was the sister ship of the Devouring Dawn and one of the most powerful vessels in the Dominion fleet. The dreadnought shields held for exactly 1.3 seconds, then they collapsed. The hull held for another 0.7 seconds. Then the entire ship simply ceased to exist, not exploded or destroyed or torn apart. It was just gone, converted to pure energy, and scattered across the void in less than 2 seconds. 12,000 crew members had been aboard the consuming night, and now there was nothing left of them but cooling plasma and expanding radiation. "Fire!" Dalvex screamed. "All ships fire everything at that vessel now." The Dominion fleet unleashed the greatest barrage of weapons fire in their history. Energy beams and missiles and kinetic projectiles and biological weapons all converged on the single black ship that had killed a dreadnought in 2 seconds. The ship moved. It did not dodge like the human frigates had dodged at Kepler 442. It simply was in one place, and then it was in another, as if it had folded space around itself to avoid the incoming fire, and then it fired again and again and again. Each shot was a death sentence, and each beam of pale blue light erased a Vorath ship from existence, as if it had never been there. At Dalvex watched in horror as his fleet was systematically destroyed by a single enemy vessel, and he could not understand what he was seeing, because nothing in the galaxy should have been capable of this retreat. He finally ordered, and his voice cracked with an emotion he had never felt before, "All ships retreat now." The Vorath fleet turned and ran. They fled from a single ship, and they left behind them the burning wreckage of 143 vessels as the Devouring Dawn jumped to subspace. Dalvex caught one last glimpse of the black ship hanging motionless in the void. It had not pursued them. It had not needed to. Message was clear: humanity had a weapon that could destroy the Vorath Dominion, and they were not afraid to use it somewhere. In the depths of that terrible vessel, a human crew watched the enemy fleet disappear, and then they turned their ship toward Home the Erebus had made its first appearance, and the galaxy would never forget the sight of it. Supreme Commander Thalvex had not slept in 7 days. He stood in the intelligence center of the Padaioids, devouring dawn surrounded by screens and data tablets and analysts, who worked around the clock trying to answer a single question. What was the Erebus? And where had it come from? Spies had been sent into human space, and most of them had been caught and killed. But a few had managed to return with fragments of information. Prisoners had been interrogated using every technique the Varath had developed over centuries of conquest, and eventually some of them had talked captured human. Databases had been dissected by the finest analysts in the Dominion, and every piece of data had been examined and cross-referenced and studied. What they found changed everything. The Erebus was not a human creation. Not until Relikirath stood beside his commander and read from the intelligence report with a voice that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. 300 years ago, when humanity first developed faster than light travel, they sent exploration ships in every direction, seeking new worlds to colonize and new resources to exploit. I know this already, Thalvex growled. Get to the point. One of those exploration ships discovered a planet on the edge of their territory, and they named it New Eden, because it appeared to be perfect for colonization with breathable air and clean water and fertile soil. Kyrith paused and swallowed hard before continuing. But when the colonists landed, they found something in the mountains, and it was a ship. Thalvex turned his full attention to his subordinate. What kind of ship? An ancient one, Commander, and the analysts estimate it had been abandoned on that world for at least 1 million years, and its builders were long dead, and their civilization was nothing but dust scattered across the galaxy. And the humans found this ship. They found it, and it was damaged beyond repair, but its technology was still intact, and they spent 2 centuries studying everything they could. The Supreme Commander felt his blood run cold as the implications became clear. They reverse-engineered alien technology, and technology that was 1,000,000 years old. Not all of it, Kyrith admitted. The reports suggest they understood perhaps 30% of what they found, but that 30% was enough. The display screens around them lit up with schematics and technical readouts that the Varath analysts had pieced together from captured data. The weapons on the Erebus were a fusion of human engineering and ancient alien science, and they operated on principles that the Varath had never even imagined. The hull was layered with materials that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, which explained why sensors could not get a clear reading, and why weapons seemed to pass through it without causing damage. The engines could fold space in ways that made Vorath subspace drives look like primitive chemical rockets. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Kyrith hesitated before delivering the final piece of information, and Thalvex could see fear in his subordinate's eyes. Commander, the Erebus is not the only such ship. The silence that followed was absolute. Explain, Thalvex said quietly. According to our intelligence, humanity has built 7 ships using the technology they recovered from New Eden, and each one is as powerful as the Erebus, and possibly more so. 7 ships, 7 vessels capable of destroying an entire fleet on their own, 7 weapons of absolute destruction, hiding somewhere in human space. They call them the Reaper Fleet. Kyrith continued. Each ship is named for a human concept of death or ending, and there is the Erebus, which is named for the Greek god of darkness, and the Thanatos, which is named for the personification of death, and the Azrael, which is named for an angel of death, and the Morrigan, which is named for a goddess of war and fate, and the Anku, which is named for a servant of death, and the Shinigami, which is named for a Japanese spirit of death, and the Kalma, which is named for a Finnish goddess of death and decay. Thalvex listened to the names, and each one felt like a stone being dropped into his stomach. They knew, he said slowly. They knew someone would come for them, and they have been preparing for this since before we even knew they existed. It appears so, Commander, and the construction of these ships began almost immediately after humanity achieved faster than light travel, and every human government contributed resources and personnel in secret, and they kept these ships hidden even from their own populations. The Supreme Commander walked to the viewing window and stared out at the stars. For a century, the Vorath Dominion had been the most powerful force in the galaxy, and they had conquered 17 civilizations without ever facing a real challenge now. They were fighting a species that had been preparing for this war for 300 years, a species that had found ancient technology and turned it into weapons of unimaginable power, a species that had hidden their true strength behind a facade of weakness and division. Tholvevs finally understood why the humans at Kepler 442 had not been afraid. They had known what was coming. They had always known. What are options? He asked, without turning from the window. Kyrith consulted his data tablet one more time before responding. Our analysts have run every projection they can, and even with our full military strength deployed against humanity, we have perhaps a 30% chance of victory. 30%. And that assumes the humans have no other surprises waiting for us. Thalvex laughed, but it was not a sound of amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had just realized that everything they believed had been wrong. They almost certainly have other surprises. He said, a species that would build 7 death ships in secret would not stop there. He stood in silence for a long moment, considering his options and weighing the costs and benefits of every possible course of action. The Vorath Dominion had never retreated from a conquest, and they had never negotiated, and they had never shown weakness. But Thalvex was old, and he was wise, and he knew that survival sometimes required doing things that had never been done before. Open a communication channel to human space, he said. We will speak with them. Kyrith's eyes widened with shock. Commander, we have never. I know what we have never done. Thalvex interrupted. But I also know what will happen if we continue this war without understanding our enemy, and perhaps there is a way to end this without both sides being destroyed. The communication channel was opened, and a message was sent requesting a meeting with the human leadership. Thalvex did not know if the humans would agree to talk. He did not know if there was anything he could offer them that would end this conflict. But he knew that he had to try, because for the first time in his long life, the Supreme Commander of the Vorath Dominion was not certain of victory, and that uncertainty terrified him more than anything he had ever faced before. The humans refused to negotiate. Admiral Chun appeared on the view screen of the Devouring Dawn, and she was older than the other human officers that Thalvex had seen during this war. Her face bore scars from battles that the Supreme Commander could only imagine, and her eyes held the weight of decades of military service. She listened to the Fige service. She listened to the Fige held the weight of decades of military service. She listened to the waitery service. She listened to the Fide Wendishton Dominion's offer of ceasefire with an expression that showed no emotion at Althovex. Had offered generous terms by Vorath standards. Humanity would remain independent, but would cede the 4 systems already captured, and would agree to share their technology with the Dominion, and would pay tribute in resources for the next 50 years. It was more than any conquered species had ever been offered. Admiral Chun's response was simple and final. You have burned 17 civilizations and enslaved trillions of sentient beings, and you have harvested sapient creatures for genetic experiments as if they were livestock, and now, because you are losing, you want peace. Thalvex tried to explain the logic of his position. The alternative is mutual destruction, and surely we can find a compromise that benefits both. We did not build the Reaper fleet for peace, Commander. Admiral Chun leaned forward, and her scarred face filled the view screen. We built it because we studied history, and we studied our history, and your history, and the history of every civilization in this galaxy, and we learned something important. What did you learn? Thalvex asked. We learned that some evils cannot be negotiated with, and some threats cannot be appeased, and some enemies can only be ended. The transmission cut to static, and Thalvax knew that there would be no more talking. The final war had begun. What followed was 11 months of the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever seen. The Vorath threw everything they had at humanity, and they deployed their entire fleet, and their ground forces, and their biological weapons, and their orbital bombardment platforms. They burned human colonies and turned green worlds into lifeless husks, and they killed millions of human civilians without mercy or hesitation. But the humans killed billions in return. The Reaper fleet struck at the heart of the Dominion with precision and fury that the Vorath could not match. The Erebus led the assault on the Vorath homeworld itself, and its terrible weapon fired again and again, turning shipyards and military installations into expanding clouds of plasma. The Thanatos targeted the Dominion's subspace communication network, and in a single coordinated strike it destroyed the relay stations that allowed the Vorath fleet to coordinate across vast distances. Suddenly the mighty Dominion armada was fragmented and isolated, with individual fleets unable to communicate or receive orders from Central Command. The Azrael hunted supply lines with patient and methodical determination, and it destroyed cargo vessels and fuel tankers and troop transports until the great bioorganic fleet began to starve. Without the nutrients and genetic material they needed to heal and grow, the living ships of the Vorath began to weaken and die. The Morrigan led raids on breeding facilities deep in Dominion territory, and within months the Vorath ability to replace their losses had been crippled. The Shinigami conducted what the humans called decapitation strikes, and it targeted the leadership of the Dominion by destroying command ships and killing high-ranking officers whenever they could be identified. The Anku and Kalma worked together to liberate the 17 conquered civilizations, and they provided weapons and training to resistance movements that rose up against their Vorath masters. Species that had been slaves for decades suddenly found themselves with the tools to fight back, and they did so with a fury born of generations of oppression. But humanity paid a terrible price for their victories. The Anku was destroyed at the siege of Vorath Prime when it was surrounded by over 100 enemy vessels, and rather than retreat, its crew chose to overload their main weapon and take as many enemies with them as possible. 37 Vorath ships died in that final explosion. The Kalma was lost defending Earth itself when a Dominion fleet broke through the outer defenses and threatened the human homeworld. Captain Jiang Wei ordered his crew to evacuate and then piloted the massive ship directly into the heart of the enemy formation. The resulting detonation destroyed every Vorath vessel within 10,000 kilometers. The Morrigan was crippled in battle, and its captain made the decision to ram the last Vorath dreadnought rather than allow the enemy to escape. Both ships were annihilated in a collision that could be seen from 3 star systems away. Billions of humans died on burned worlds, and entire generations were lost to the fires of war. Colonies that had taken centuries to build were reduced to ash, and our children grew up knowing nothing but conflict and fear and loss. But still humanity fought on, because they had decided long ago that they would rather die free than live in chains. In the final battle of the war, Supreme Commander Thalvax stood on the bridge of the devouring dawn and watched the 4 surviving Reapers close in around him. His ship was the last Vorath capital vessel, and it was damaged and dying with hull breaches on multiple decks and weapons systems failing one by one. The rest of the Dominion fleet was gone and scattered across 100 battlefields as wreckage and debris. Empire that had taken a century to build had been destroyed in less than a year. Thalvax opened a communication channel one final time. Why, he asked. You could have hidden, and you could have surrendered, and you could have survived as our subjects as other species did. And why did you fight to extinction? Admiral Chun's voice came back tired but unbroken. Because we are human, and we have been fighting our own extinction since We climbed down from the trees, and we survived ice ages and plagues and wars and our own worst impulses. She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something like pity in her voice. We looked at your dominion and your empire of slaves and corpses, and we decided that we would rather die free than live under your rule. But here is the thing, Commander. Her voice hardened. We are not the ones who died. The Erebus fired one final time, the devouring dawn ceased to exist. The war was over. The Varth Dominion collapsed within months of Thalvex's death, and without their military to enforce obedience, the conquered species rose up and claimed their freedom. 17 civilizations began the long work of rebuilding, and they would remember humanity as the species that had broken their chains. Humanity emerged from the war scarred and diminished, but unbroken. They had lost a third of their population, and 12 of their 40 worlds were nothing but ash and the Reaper. Fleet had been reduced to only 4 ships, but they had won, and the galaxy looked at this young and violent and stubborn species and learned a lesson that would echo through the ages. Humanity was not to be conquered. Humanity was not to be enslaved. Humanity would fight and sacrifice and burn worlds and shatter empires and tear down the stars themselves if that was what survival required. In the years that followed, the surviving Reapers were repaired and upgraded, and they took up silent vigil in the dark spaces between stars. They were a warning and a promise and a message to any species that might look at humanity and see weakness. The message was simple: come at us again, see what happens. And in the great hall of the United Earth Government, the names of the fallen were carved into walls of black stone. The crews of the Anku and the Kalma and the Morriganthi. Billions who died on burned worlds. The soldiers who gave everything so that humanity could survive. They were remembered, and they were honored, and their sacrifice was never forgotten, because that was what it meant to be human: to fight and to fall and to rise again. No matter what the cost, no matter what the odds, humanity endured, and the galaxy would never forget it.